right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our next lecture, which is the Renaissance and Colonization. So, first and foremost, I must apologize because in the last part of our previous video, there was a bit of audio interference, and I've fixed the mic. It's mounted now, and I hope that's going to help with the sound. Anyway, I'll just re-record in case there are issues. So just wanted to apologize for that. Dun sa last kasi, I was debating about whether or not I should re-record, and it was just the very end where I was concluding. So feel ko okay lang yun. Anyway, so coming back to it, here we're going to talk about our first lecture under early modern origins of Europe. So this lesson preview, medyo mabagal kasi yung internet, but this is supposed to be a tour of one of the palazzos or there's this chapel in one of the houses, like grand houses in Venice, and we're gonna see one type of Renaissance art from that era. But it's okay. We'll do that later. So in our coverage for the Renaissance, we're going to talk about the Renaissance itself very quickly with some, background on what the timeline looks like for this era. And then we'll specifically focus on the Italian Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance, and monarchical and colonial expansion, which kind of happens at the same time as the Renaissance takes place in its key areas. No? So, uh, really, we're looking at transformations of Europe in this era, just for us to understand how new states are emerging, what are the key movements and revolutions that end up shaping our concept of early modern Europe. So let's start with defining the Renaissance. Now, when it comes to the Renaissance, as we learned in the previous lesson, not all spaces actually had a Renaissance. In fact, in some places, the key developments had to do with rising monarchies and exploration and conquest. So, in order for us to kind of represent all of these things and sample them, I have chosen the typical topics, the Italian Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance, and then added rising monarchies or absolutism, and the age of exploration and conquest. We're just going to cover these in quick notes because we have many more topics to go through, but at least, we have a sample of what the era looked like. So, before we get to those focal points, though, let's talk about the word Renaissance first. So, if you recall, that guy, Petrarch, who himself was a writer in the Renaissance era, was one of the first to really periodize for us how European time was evolving, right? And in his time period, he saw that the Renaissance was an era of rebirth, no? Now, in terms of the historiographic context or the way historians have thought about Renaissance history, the period of the Renaissance became a more dominant feature in historical writing after the writings of Jacob Burckhardt, right? So he wrote this in 1890, no, 1890, sorry, 1860. Notice he's a 19th century writer. And in his book, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, um, he was the one who influenced modern day writers or more recent writers to include the Renaissance as a major theme in the development of Europe. So kumbaga, pinipick up niya yung mga sinasabi nila Petrarch from that era, he analyzed it and made it part of the historical canon. If you remember from Liakos, right? What that means is the typical way, the accepted way we write about the past of a particular place. Okay, so contexts first. Some of these we're already familiar with, some of them are a little new to us, right? So, as you recall, the Black Death from the 1300s to the 1400s really set the tone for the Renaissance. So, imagine you're someone who, for many generations, or you're a family that for many generations witnessed the Black Death, whether you're a noble or you're a peasant or even part of the clergy, everyone had encounters with this plague. No? So the recovery and the slow mm, transition away from the bubonic plague actually set the intellectual climate for rediscovering the glorious past of antiquity. because now people weren't getting sick as much as they were during the Black Death. And they were starting to really think about, it was an existential moment. They were starting to think about what it meant to be alive and what kinds of literature, politics, economics they should go back to in order to rebuild from that period. No. So this is a really interesting, I don't know if it's a Netflix show, but it's a telling of the Decameron, which takes place during the Black Death. I don't think it's for everyone, but it's really really funny if you want to see a bit of the context for the time. So it's called the Decameron. Anyway, one other context is we find the rise of Italian city states and specifically the rise of the banking industry. So, you've heard the name Medici before, right? And the House of Medici, or the literally the family of Medici, becomes the greatest bank in Europe, which helps fund both wars and discovery or commerce. No? So, the rise of Italian city states is a focal point we'll talk about later. But essentially, this is one place where the Renaissance really takes place, right? And it's strange because it's a very, very small set of territories, but that is their geographic context, their economic context, um, allows the Renaissance to emerge because many of the arts we find, whether that's sculptures or paintings or even architectural features, it was funded by the money that came from these emerging uh, commercial houses and commercial families. So, besides that, we also find that the Hundred Years' War is starting to come into conclusion. Right. So, as we know, political disorder between England and France causes political disruption and famine in Western Europe because it's a Hundred Years' War, and part of those wars typically include burning agricultural land so your enemy starves, diba? So, continuing conflicts between England and France over Italy, because this war really expanded into different parts of Europe, would later lead to the decline of Italian states in Europe. So, these are just large contexts, so you can see how previous turning points are impacting the Renaissance era. Okay. So, if those are contexts, this is where it gets a little bloody. What are critical turning points for this period? Okay. So there's a lot that happens here, right? So don't get overwhelmed yet with the things written on the timeline. What I've decided to do is divide this into centuries. So unlike before, where we were looking at specific dates. Now, we're just going to have a few specific dates, but what's more important is to be able to tell the story of how politics and I guess economic activities are expanding, contracting throughout different centuries. No? So, let's start with the 14th century. Now, even if in the conventional timeline, they say the Renaissance starts in the 1500s, it's not possible to understand the Renaissance without looking at where they took place. No. So, the beginnings of the Italian Renaissance actually happen as Italian city states begin to expand, right? Or begin to kind of strengthen themselves. So, I'll just read the description here and I'll explain it on the next slide now. So, if you recall, Italy as a space, it's in West Rome, right? It's outside the Byzantine Empire. So, following the collapse of Roman territories in Italy to attacks of the Lombards, a Germanic group, local rulers begin to assert their authority to protect their cities and expand their territories. So, if you look at these cities, actually, not everyone who rules them is a monarch. In fact, many of them were banking and merchant families, such as the Medici family, who tightens their hold over Florence and later expands to Tuscany. So, five major Italian states emerge because of their wealth, but also because of how they're negotiating politics within the small space of northern and central Italy. Right? So, you have Milan, Venice, Florence, the Papal States, and Naples. So soon after, because of the wealth concentrated in these places, and the fact that everyone's just trying to recover from the Black Death, um, they start to return to classical humanism, art, and other sciences. So the scholars that we find using those materials are Dante, Da Vinci, Petrarch, and many other names that are familiar to us. So this is what's happening in the transition from the 14th to the 15th century. So in the 15th century, another interesting thing happens because while you have the Italian Renaissance in Italy, in the north, you start to see the Christian Renaissance, right? So while the Renaissance in Italy was marked by the rediscovery of materials and inspiration from classical antiquity, northern states went through artistic movements inspired by a Christian Renaissance. So uh, we'll see who those are later. But for now, it's important to note that the Italian Renaissance tended to be more secular. And then the Northern Renaissance really started developing religious themes as part of the wider. So I'm trying to think about how to explain it without saying too much, right? Ganito na lang, no? Because they were thinking about a Christian Renaissance in arts and in the way it was taught in everyday spaces, this is also the place where the Reformation eventually is going to erupt. No, so they're rethinking their Christianity essentially in many ways: art, politics, even economies, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the Reformation. So while that's happening in northern Europe, an interesting thing is also happening in the Iberian Peninsula specifically. So we find the beginnings of European global expansion, which is what some people call the Age of Discovery, right? Um, Centering in places like Spain and Portugal. They were really the first major colonizers, right? Even if they have different approaches to colonialism. So, what this means is we find a shift in certain states, particularly these large monarchical states, where they're shifting from a medieval agrarian economy to a mercantilist or trading system. So they still have an agricultural economy, pero kumbaga nadadagdagan yung economic activities nila. So, as we know, Spain colonizes the New World or the Americas, and Portugal takes over the Indian Ocean spice trade from the Muslims. So I just want to give you some illustrations related to that. No, if you look at this image on the left, you'll see Italy in about 700 CE. So this is still in the medieval ages. No, and as we know, in the medieval ages, Western Rome was collapsing. In the face of several Germanic invasions. So, dito natin makikita kung gaano kalawak yung Lombard Kingdom after they took territory from Western Rome. So, kokonti na lang yung natitira. Essentially, yung yellow parts, yun na lang yung controlled ng Byzantine Empire. And of course, you have Rome right there, diba? Which, if you recall, this is right before um, the Pope asks for help from the Frankish kings. And it is quite a desperate situation, right? So we already discussed that before in class, no? So let's pick up with what happens next. Imagine you are some of the cities that were previously part of the Roman Empire. And, in the 15th century, with issues as well in the Germanic kingdoms, nagsilabasan na yung iba't ibang maliliit na states that were asserting their autonomy, their territory against foreign invaders. Kaya lalabas yung places like the Venetian Republic, diba, Florence, the Papal States. So at the beginning of the Renaissance, at the beginning of the Renaissance, this territory that was once Western Rome that fell to Germanic tribes now looks like this. And this is where the Renaissance takes place. So, um, as we move on to the 16th century, we find that monarchical governments like France, England, Spain, and Portugal are really developing their internal organization. Kumbaga, they're becoming stronger monarchical states by developing their armies, sometimes going to war, developing stronger narratives for who they are as kingdoms, right? And just as a sample of what wars are taking place to determine territorial boundaries, right? We have the Italian wars from 1510 to 1527. So Spain in this set of wars, France and Spain are actually warring over control in Italy. particularly yung part dito sa taas. So they're trying to take over those territories, and because of that, these strong Italian city-states start to face their decline kasi ina-attack na sila ng France and Spain. So once that happens, you start to see a shift in the balance of power towards Western and Central Europe. So lalakas ulit yung Spain in particular. So by the 17th century, we see new powers emerging and more colonies starting to pop up around the world as more and more kingdoms realize they can participate in colonial expansion. So, one of the major powers that emerges in this era is the Dutch Republic. So, mahabang yung kwento ng Dutch, but once the Dutch emerge, essentially after they shake off Spain, because they used to be part of Spanish territories, no? But once they become independent, they start to take over the Portuguese maritime empire in Africa, particularly the one that rounds the base at the Cape of Good Hope, the Indian Ocean, and Southeast Asia. So eventually, they take up in Indonesia, di ba? Kaya yung colonizer ng Indonesia are the Dutch. So, may transition na nagaganap dito. If the initial empires were Spain and Portugal, by the 17th century, that balance is starting to shift in favor of the Dutch Republic over the Portuguese. And the French and British also begin to assert their, not even authority, their strength in the colonial world. So this is when we start to see the Americas begin to really have new colonies from France and Britain. So eventually lalabas yung sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee plantations. So these growing economies and the decimation of indigenous American populations increases the need for slave imports from West Africa. So, while the British and the French and even the Spanish, right, and the Portuguese are taking over the Americas, because so many locals die due to diseases, a lot of them, millions of people die because of diseases, relocations, but as well as actual military conflict, no? There's a really kind of evil labor supply need that emerges. And this is what triggers the importation of African slaves across the Atlantic. So I point this out. We'll talk about it more later, but I point this out so we can see how, you know, the era we talk about as the Renaissance, um, as much as there were beautiful works of art that came out of it, it was also a period of many, many wars, a lot of political strife, and in fact, the birth of some of the most intense large scale evils of the world like slavery, right? So it's really a mixed bag. As much as we celebrate the Renaissance for its intellectual artistic developments, we can't forget the atrocities that also happened alongside that process. So that's it for our mini timeline, right? You can just go back in the video to review what we looked at. But essentially, we looked at four focal points for the discussion on the Renaissance. We looked at three key contexts related to um, the medieval ages, essentially, and how they're bridging into the Renaissance. And we also looked at a rough timeline from the 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, just for us to get a taste of what was changing and transforming across Europe. Okay.